And with that, I would like to turn it over to our speaker for today. Our speaker is Secretary of State Steve Simon, and I will let you take it away.
Okay, well, thank you so much. Can you hear and see me okay?
We can, yes.
Okay, good. Thank you. It's a pleasure to be with you all. I really, really appreciate it. It's really an honor to be invited. It's great to be here with distinguished members of the bar. And I see now, even though everyone was just let in from the waiting room, as I'm scrolling very quickly, I see some familiar names. I can't say faces because I can't see your faces, but some familiar names among those of you who have joined today. So it's an honor to be with some friends. But it's also an honor for another reason, which is that I am one of you. I am a lawyer. And not only that, I'm the first lawyer since 1891 to be Minnesota Secretary of State. First one since 1891. Not the first. I'm the fourth lawyer, but for some reason, Minnesotans took a holiday of over 120 years in terms of electing lawyers for this job. But we are back. We are definitely back. And it's great to be with you for that, among other reasons. In terms of my own background, I started out in public practice. I take it many of you are public lawyers, and I started my career with the Office of Attorney General in Minnesota. So I spent nearly 5 years there with a couple different divisions in the office. Then I went to private practice at the Robbins Kaplan Law Firm in Minneapolis. And then I was in the legislature and now here at the Office of Secretary of State. And I have to say, just as an aside, that being a lawyer has really helped in this job. Obviously not a prerequisite because most have not been lawyers, but it really has been very helpful to me. I think there's a lot about the practice of law. There's a lot about the nuance of law that really comes in handy on a day-to-day basis in this job. So let me talk a little bit about that job, and then we'll get into some of the analysis. I've been asked to talk about election law, particularly the changes that have been made over the past year or so in election law and what those mean for the future and what some of the challenges are in the future and how those might be addressed by the law itself. So let's just zoom out a little bit and talk about this office. Some of you are aware of this, some of you are not, or some of you are maybe vaguely aware of it. But we have a lot of responsibilities in the Minnesota Constitution and in statute for our office. We do a lot of things. For example, we are sort of the welcome mat for Minnesota businesses when it comes to business registration. The very first thing that a business is likely to do before they get an office or hire people or get insurance or a tax ID number or anything else is to make the actual entity come alive legally. And that is what you do through our office and a host of other related sort of commercial documents that we also take in filings for. So we are, as I say, sort of the welcome mat for Minnesota businesses. We also run a program called the Safe at Home program. Safe at Home is an address confidentiality program for victims of domestic violence, stalking, others who fear for their safety, and it's life-saving work. It means if you're in the program that your true home address, your physical address, is a secret for all purposes, public and private. And that has taken a lot of legal architecture that's been developed and refined over the years that our office has been at the forefront of, but it's life-saving work and really gratifying. But there's no question that the duty and the responsibility of our office that gets the most interest, the most attention, and yes, the most scrutiny is elections. That's what I'm here to talk about it today. It's the one that most Minnesotans probably most readily associate with our office, that responsibility. So I want to say a little bit about that just to set the table. We do a lot of things, but here's what we don't do in the Office of Secretary of State. We do not count votes. This is going to be important later. We don't count votes. We never have. We probably never will. That is a decentralized function that many of you know occurs in thousands of places throughout Minnesota. We have over 3,000 polling places in Minnesota. We have hundreds of counties and, of course, cities and townships. They're the ones who do the counting. We post results that they count, but we never touch a ballot. We're never in the same room as a ballot, typically, at least on election night. And so that's something we don't do. We don't hire or train or pay the election workers, the so-called election judges, as they're referred to in Minnesota. We don't do that either. That too is undertaken by folks at the local level. So what do we do? Well, We sort of train the trainers when it comes to a lot of things, including election judges. We certify all the elections equipment. We stand up and run and maintain the huge databases that are the spine of the system. And maybe most importantly, we do the policy and the legal work at the Minnesota Capitol and with our federal partners in Washington, D.C. So we are immersed in the ins and outs of statutes and administrative rules that pertaining to elections. And it's great, by the way, for a lawyer in particular. You may know, or I'm sure you know of Alan Dershowitz, the famous sort of celebrity lawyer, loved by some, scorned by others, but universally, I would say, respected for his intellect. And he once said that it is every lawyer's dream to help shape the law, not just react to it. I think that's right. And one of the privileges of being in this job as a lawyer is I get to have at least a hand, at least indirectly, sometimes directly, a hand in shaping the law. So as a result of these responsibilities that we have in our office when it comes to elections, I like to say that I and we are in the democracy business. And I think you'll agree with me that it is one heck of a time right now to be in the democracy business for a lot of reasons, particularly because we are obviously in a presidential election year and a consequential one. Now, I am an optimist about democracy overall. I'm a long-term optimist about democracy in America and in Minnesota. In the short term and in the medium term, of course, we have problems and challenges, which I'm going to get to, which have definitely a legal dimension. But I'm an optimist because, look, the last few years have been a real stress test for democracy. But I think we've passed and even occasionally aced the test, certainly in Minnesota. Does democracy feel a little bit dinged and dented over the last few years? I would say yes. But definitely not broken. And one of the reasons it's not broken, and we know this from 2020, is the institutions that matter really stood up. Whether it's the free press, whether it's the military, for example. We are not like other nations who, in similar situations, might have had dueling tanks in the streets. We didn't have, soldiers, sailors, and airmen loyal to Joe Biden or loyal to Donald Trump duking it out in the streets across America. It's strange to have to say so, but I think as lawyers, sometimes we have to understand that that is the case in far too much of the rest of the world. And then finally, and most pertinent for all of us, is the courts. Our independent judiciary really worked and in many ways saved the day in 2020. People embraced the rule of law, regardless of who appointed them, regardless of their political allegiance. And I think that's put us in a really good place. So this year too is going to be a test, no question about that. It's going to be an intense year, very intense. It already is. And we just want to make sure that that intensity from a legal and other standpoints is managed. What I've said over the past several months is that I have two wishes between now and election day. Two wishes. If I could wave a magic wand, the two things that I would wish for the next few months are high turnout and low drama. That's what I want. High turnout and low drama. I think we can get there. I'm more confident about the first one than I am about the second one, this being Minnesota and all. But that I think frames how I'm looking at the next few months. So I just want to acknowledge here and say something which most people, I assume, on this meeting know, but it always bears repeating and it's always fun to repeat, which is that Minnesota is really, really good at voting. We are so, so good at it. Going back not just years, but decades, we have perennially been champions. For 3 out of the last 4 elections, we have been literally the champion. We've been #1 in America in voter turnout, including the COVID election of 2020, when we had all that uncertainty and anxiety and even fear. And we were doing this again through in a once in a century pandemic. So we're really, really good at it. And I get asked the question quite a bit, as you might imagine, given my job, whether I have an opinion about why that is. What is it about Minnesota that puts us in such a good place? What is it about us that makes us year after year after year, if not #1 in the country, second, third, fourth, or fifth among these sort of elite states in terms of voter turnout, regardless of who's in charge, Republicans, Democrats, anything like that? Why is it? What's the secret sauce? Is it something in the water? Is it dumb luck? Is it a coincidence? Well, not surprisingly, I don't think it's any of those things. I think you could explain it in a lot of different ways, but the one way I want to focus on today is laws. I believe that we have had really good laws on the books going back many decades, put there by both Democrats and Republicans, by the way, and added to and improved upon over the years, including recently. And that has put us in a very, very good position. Now, from where I sit, when it comes to crafting laws around elections. I think in this country, I can't speak really knowledgeably about other countries, but in this country, it seems to me that when you're talking about laws and legislation around elections, it's always really a chase for the perfect blend, which you'll never find, so the chase will never be over. The chase for the perfect blend of two things: access and security. Access and security, those are the two main things. Access, meaning you want it to be open. You want it to be not a hassle. You want it to be relatively easy. You don't want unnecessary hoops and hurdles and barriers and burdens. But security means that you want only eligible voters and no one else to take advantage of that accessibility. Now, no one on this call would plot that on a graph in exactly the right place. If one axis is of the graph is access and one is security, we all would put a dot in a different place. So reasonable people can disagree, that's for sure. But if you look at the sweep of history of the last few decades, I just want to isolate a couple examples or so of what I mean by that, historically speaking. So one that many of you are familiar with, maybe because of personal experience, is same-day or election day voter registration. This is a reform that Minnesota adopted in 1973, so we've had it for over 50 years. We were one of the first and earliest adopters, and it means what it sounds like. It means that if you're unregistered or maybe you need to change your registration, you can do it on game day. You can do it on election day in a polling place. There's no cutoff before election day. Now, still to this day, 51 years later, we're still one of only 16 or so states that has it. It's not like it's received anything close to universal adoption. And in most of the rest of America, as some of you know, because maybe you've lived in those states, the rule today in 2024 is if you aren't registered to vote, say a month before the election, you're done. You're out. There is no exception. There's no back door. There's no anything. Doesn't matter if you forgot, misunderstood the law, you were ill, you're out. And for 50 years plus, Minnesota has said that is not who or what we want to be. And so that's an example historically of something that set the table for really strong turnout. There are other examples, like the fact that a decade or more ago, we became one of the first states, now it's the vast majority of states, to allow online voter registration. And then a final example I'll just give that's historic, although not that old, was the enactment in 2013 of the law, which I have some pride of authorship because it was my bill during my last term in the legislature, that allows anyone who's eligible to vote in Minnesota to vote from home. You no longer need an excuse or a doctor's note or an explanation or anything. Anyone in Minnesota who's eligible can vote from their couch or kitchen table by just having the ballot sent to them. And little did we know in 2013 that that is what would pretty much save the 2020 election. During COVID and lockdowns and all that fear and anxiety, Minnesotans in massive numbers took advantage of that law to vote from home in ways that I don't know we'll ever see again. A massive spike, a more than doubling over the course of one election in the number of people who chose to vote that way for pretty obvious reasons during the heart of COVID in pre-vaccine America. So those are some examples historically of what have put us in a really good place. But this past legislative session, the one that just ended a couple days ago, was truly historic. And many of you know, because you're familiar with a lot of different issues and are more expert on them than I am, across issue areas in Minnesota, the 2023-24 legislative session will go down as one of the most impactful in the history of the state of Minnesota. Now, there are people on this call who like that output. There are people, I bet, who don't like that output, and some of you are maybe somewhere in the middle. But no one can say it isn't impactful. The sheer mass and breadth and depth of the output across many issues was really extraordinary. And that's no different in this lane, the democracy lane. So I'm going to focus on that. And I want to talk about some of the changes that were made over the last couple of years, particularly in 2023, that have had and will continue to have a big impact on the democracy business and on the way we vote and on elections in Minnesota. So I want to talk about that and really focus it there. But before I do that, one all-purpose disclaimer. I think it's important to say, and I've been saying it in other places too. There are wise, smart, honest, ethical, patriotic people everywhere, and for sure on this call, who will disagree with me on elections policy generally, and or people who believe that one or more of the new laws that I'm about to highlight are bad ideas. And that's okay. I'm not here to preach. I'm here to discuss. Although I will tell you, I was for all of these things. And I hope there's time, if you have the inclination at the end, where we can have a back and forth. But I just want to point out that all of the things I'm about to mention, every single one of them, without exception, they are all bipartisan or really nonpartisan in origin and in effect, meaning they don't benefit any particular political party, and multiple states of varying political complexions have already, in some cases for many years, implemented them. So-called red states, so-called purple states, so-called blue states. So we are by no means the pioneer here or the trailblazer. Other states have done this of varying political complexions. So let me talk about a few of them. Some of them, or maybe most or all of them, you'll be familiar with. I'll start with the one that was probably the biggest headline grabber from the 2023 session, one that I and many, many others worked on for a long, long time, and that was restoration of the freedom to vote for people who have left prison behind. This is a big deal. This is about 55,000 Minnesotans who before last June didn't have the right to vote, and now they do. These are folks who have done every last minute, every last second of their time in incarceration, have been out in some cases for years or even decades, and now have that freedom to vote. And some of you are maybe familiar, but it bears repeating, what the legal framework is in this country and what it was in Minnesota. There are four main buckets or baskets of laws across the states with respect to people who are serving or have served a felony sentence. Over on this side of the continuum are two states, Maine and Vermont, where you never lose the right to vote, ever. You could be serving 10 consecutive life sentences as an axe murderer, and you don't lose the right to vote, ever. That's unusual, and they're outliers. Then there's the next group of states, the category to which Minnesota moved last year, that says we're going to have a bright line rule. If you're incarcerated for a felony, you can't vote. But the minute you step out, the minute you're done with your incarceration, you get that freedom to vote back, even if you're still serving part of your sentence on paper, meaning probation, supervised release, and the like. So it's a bright line rule. Incarcerated, no. The minute you step out, yes, regardless of circumstances, whether you have a lot, a little, or no time left on your sentence in other ways. And that's the category to which we moved, and a growing category. North Dakota has been doing this for years. Iowa is almost there. Kentucky's headed there. Nebraska's heading there. Florida is in a messy process of heading there. So it defies political categories. And so that's something that we did. As I said, it's 55,000 people in Minnesota. And now the challenge from a policy standpoint is just getting the word out. How many of those 55,000 people at this moment on May 22nd know or appreciate or understand that this is even a thing, that they have the freedom to vote back? So we're working with the Department of Corrections, a lot of community groups throughout the state, and just getting the word out that this is a thing, that people can exercise their freedom to vote if they wish to. Another reform that I wanted to highlight that came up and was passed last year is automatic voter registration. Now, time out for a second. I really wish, and have wished for a long time, that that reform went by another name. I think it's not quite fully descriptive. When I think about something that's automatic, I don't know about you, I think humans aren't involved. I think it's some algorithm or a computer or someone doing something. There's no human discretion. That's what I think. And I think a lot of other people probably do too, but that's not what this is. This is really only a step removed from something we've had for 30 plus years. For 30 plus years in Minnesota, we've had a motor voter law, which means what it sounds like. It means when you get or renew a driver's license in Minnesota, you have had since the early 90s the opportunity, if you wish, to opt in to registering to vote. You may have noticed, I did when I last did my driver's license, that there for 30 years, there's a form, or there's a box on one of the forms when you go to renew your driver's license that used to say, hey, check here if you want to be registered to vote. It's an opt-in framework. All that automatic voter registration does is basically change the presumption. I'm simplifying a little bit here, but that is basically what it does. Same driver's license office, same eye chart test, same everything. But instead of being asked on a form whether you wish to be registered to vote, it will assume if you are otherwise eligible, and that's the key. If you are a citizen, if you are a resident, if you are over 18, it will assume that you wish to be registered to vote and will register you to vote. You can always opt out afterwards, but this is an opt-out framework, not an opt-in framework. So a term like automatic voter registration sounds sweeping and penetrating, but it's really only a gloss on what we've had for 30 plus years. Now, the law was written, wisely in my view, such that it didn't have a particular effective date. Rather, it became effective when we in our office certified that it was system ready. I'll spare you all the technical details because there are a lot of them, but we had to do a lot of work with the Division of Vehicle Services and the Department of Public Safety, and it is now a go. It is green lighted as of last month. And we are now processing automatic voter registrations. And this will go a long way towards um, drastically reducing the number of people in Minnesota who are eligible to vote but unregistered. It will also clean the voting rolls. It has that advantage as well. Why? Because we're now able to do the vetting and the screening and the filtering of people who are registered to vote far earlier than we otherwise would have. So that's a good thing, I think, as well. So it's about accessibility, but it's also about accuracy. A related reform that I want to talk about is pre-registration. Pre-registration for high school students, particularly 16 and 17-year-olds. This too is really a gloss on what we have. We already have the ability for those who were 17 but would be 18 by the next election to, in essence, get in line to register to vote. And that's what pre-registration is. It's getting in line. It means a 16 or 17-year-old who's otherwise eligible, have to be a citizen, have to be a resident. They can go to our website, which is mnvotes.gov. They can fill out the same form that someone does to register to vote, only theirs will be on pending status until midnight on their 18th birthday. And a real human being will see and check and verify to see whether that person, that applicant, is who they say they are and lives where they say they live. And if everything checks out, then that 16 or 17-year-old, when they turn 18 at midnight, will be added to the voting rolls. And the policy idea here is, and we know this from other states of varying political complexions, whether it's Florida or Hawaii or others, that it gets young people thinking about themselves as voters before they actually are voters officially. And the reason that's good is because we know that if a young person votes that first time they're eligible at 18, 19, 20, or whatever, they're far more likely to make it a lifelong habit. We just know that. The other thing we know from actual peer-reviewed studies it makes a difference. This isn't just one of those happy talk bills you pass so you can convince yourself you're doing something about a problem. This is subject to measurement and objective analysis, and there have been noticeable spikes in the number of young people at 18, 19, 20, 21 in those states who have registered and who have voted. So we know it works. We hope and have every reason to suspect it'll work in Minnesota as well. And I have been doing my part. This school year, I went to 33 different high schools across Minnesota talking about pre-registration. Started with Albert Lee and ended up at a school in Minneapolis. So that's been a joy to hear what young people have to say about voting, and even just the mechanics and the legal aspect of voting as well. There's so much mystery, unnecessary in my view, and sort of we need to demystify the process. And so that's part of what I've been trying to do. Yet another innovation that I want to bring to your attention that passed in 2023 is the creation of a permanent absentee list, which means what it sounds like, which means Minnesotans are increasingly liking the option to vote from home, liking the option of voting from their couch or kitchen table. And there's some, a growing number, who are saying they want to vote that way for every election. So this reform allows you and me, or anyone we know who's eligible to vote, to sign up on a permanent absentee list. You can always remove your name, of course, easily, by the way. But if you want to basically, as a default, say, you know, from now on, city of X or county of X, wherever you live, from now on when there's an election, I don't want to apply every time on a one-off sort of cafeteria style basis. I just want you to put me on a permanent list. And until and unless I say otherwise, just keep them coming. Keep the ballots coming every election and just send them to me at this address. That's something that many other states, again, of varying political complexions, have done. I think it's going to put us in a good place to those who want that option. To those who want to go to a polling place, that's always available to you as well. And again, it's just an accommodation for Minnesotans who increasingly say that this is the way that they want to vote. Another reform, long overdue in my judgment, is time off for absentee voting. Now, for a long, long time, we've had a very sensible law in the books, as many states do, that allow reasonable time off employers that compel employers to provide reasonable time off to vote on election day. That's been on the books for a long, long time. But as more and more Minnesotans decide that they don't necessarily want to vote on election day, that doesn't work for them or their lives or their families or their schedule. They want to vote the day before, the week before, even the month before. It's high time that we expanded that law to include absentee voting as well. So now, during our absentee voting period, which is 46 days, by the way, and that's a long absentee ballot period. Used to be 30, but it was expanded some number of years ago to 46. During that 46-day period, an employer must allow reasonable time off to go and vote absentee, meaning over lunch hour or at some other lull, to go to the county courthouse or the vote center or city hall or wherever it might be in your particular community to vote absentee, so not just election day. Another one that I wanted to highlight that I am personally proud of, because our office played a particularly direct and lead role in this one, is expansion of opportunities for absentee voting and Native American Indian lands, particularly on reservations. And here's what's been going on in Minnesota. I gather in other states as well, but I can't speak with any authority on those other places. In Minnesota, as many of you know, we have 11 federally recognized sovereign Indian nations. They are sovereign governments in most of the same ways that a county government is. And yet some of them have endured challenges in terms of physical polling locations, both on election day and during the absentee voting period. There are several counties, in particular Minnesota, that were sort of in a standoff, you might say, or at an impasse with certain Indian tribal governments about where to locate either game day, election day polling places or absentee locations as well. And when you look at the map in some of these situations, there's no question that folks in reservation communities, in some instances, not all, but in some instances, have to travel further, drive further, go further in order to vote in person, either on election day or when it comes to absentee voting. So we came up with a plan and we got the plan done. And the plan was to say this, and we thought it was a reasonable sort of accommodation of everyone's interest. For the first time in state history, first time since 1858, we now have a law, and we wrote the language in our office, that says that during the absentee voting period, upon request by a sovereign tribal government, one of the 11, a county in which such a government is situated must provide at least one day, so that's the floor, one day of a physical polling place during the absentee period. So during that 46 days, they can't go below 1 day. They could do 10 days or 3 days or 2 days, but they can't not do 1 day. And this is a start, I think, of making sure that at least 1 day there is a polling site during the absentee polling process or voting process that is on Indian reservation land, typically at a headquarters and the like. So this isn't going to affect every county, because not every county contains within it or touches a federally recognized Indian territory or Native American territory. But this is a start towards getting to some equity. And I just want to say that there are some counties that have a really good relationship with their adjacent tribal governments, some less so. I'm not going to name names. But this now puts everyone on a level playing field and does something for the first time in state history that I think should have been done a long time ago. So that's something that we and I are particularly proud of. And we've really made a point in the ensuing year, since it was passed in 2023, of reaching out proactively to all 11 tribal governments and to all the counties that are affected by this to say, hey, work this out early, negotiate what the particular day is going to be. We didn't want to be overly prescriptive in the statute and say it has to be a particular date, but now there is a floor of 1 day where upon request, there has to be an absentee polling place located right there on tribal lands. So I think that's a good thing. I want to talk about election worker protection. This is an issue that's come up a lot nationally. I think it's not lost on many of you that this is an issue in this country, has been over the last few years. There has been a marked uptick and increase in this country of acts of intimidation or threats aimed at election workers of all kinds, whether that's election judges who work in the polling place only on election day, or, as is more the case in states like Minnesota, election administrators, the people who do the job the other 364 days out of the year. And just a word about that. Um, in Minnesota, we're in really, really good shape when it comes to polling place security. I'm not saying nothing bad could happen, and I'm not being Pollyanna here, and we're always, hoping for the best, but planning for the worst. And we have people on staff, one person in particular, whose job it is to be a liaison with counties and cities on physical security in polling places. So I don't take it for granted. But we have a structure of laws in place in Minnesota that put us in a really, really good position when it comes to, and this is not a new one, by the way. This is just to set the table for what the new one is. But that put us in a really good position in terms of security in the polling place on election day. So in other states, their statutory language is pretty murky when it comes to polling place access. In Minnesota, it is not murky. It is crystal clear. And whether you like the law or not, no one can plausibly and reasonably say it is not crystal clear, because it is. The rule in Minnesota with respect to polling places on election day is this: the only person who can be within 100 feet of a polling place on election day, the only people are voters, election workers, and someone who naturally works in that building, a church, a school, a community center, and the like. There is an exception to that, and that is that every major political party, only the major ones, can designate one person, one, not a swarm of 50, not 20, not even two. One person per major political party must be designated in writing to show up and be a poll challenger at the polling place. Designated in writing is important. No one can show up at a polling place on election day and say, well, I'm here for the Republicans, I'm here for the Democrats, you got to let me in. I'm the one person. Not good enough. That person's got to be designated in writing. And then once they're inside, in statute, the following restrictions are in force. That person, that challenger, cannot speak to a voter. That challenger cannot be within 6 feet of a voter. And that challenger can only make challenges to a voter's eligibility based on personal knowledge. That's the statutory term, personal knowledge. What that means is no hunches, vibes, or feelings are allowed. It's not enough to say, I'm challenging her because I heard her speaking Swedish in the hallway, so she can't possibly be an American citizen. Or I'm challenging him because there's just something funny about him. I just don't get a good vibe. Not enough. You can say, I'm challenging her because I saw her take out her Swedish passport in the hallway, or I know her from my neighborhood and she's from France, or whatever it is. That's okay. But no whims, no vibes, no hunches. That's simply not good enough. So I say all that because that's been the longstanding state of the law in Minnesota, and that's put us at a really good place. I know of virtually no instances in Minnesota since I've had this job of the kind of threats and harassment and intimidation in the polling place. Similarly, we have some judge-made rules and laws that apply. Some of you may remember a few years ago, there was a U.S. Supreme Court case that came from Minnesota about political apparel in the polling place. And the, I think, sensible outcome that the Supreme Court produced in that case, now the law everywhere as a matter of the First Amendment, is that no, the court said it's too broad to say you can't have any political clothing or buttons or badges or hats or whatever in the polling place. But what is reasonable under the First Amendment is to say that in an effort to prevent electioneering and over politicization in the polling place, you can ban, as Minnesota does, those items that depict or show or symbolize candidates on the ballot that day. So for this November, if you want to go into the polling place with your Tim Pawlenty hat or your Mark Dayton t-shirt, great. Have at it. But don't do it with something that bears the name or the logo of Donald Trump or Joe Biden. That's the sort of First Amendment accommodation. So back to 2023 and what was done this last legislative session. I just wanted to set the table for what the law was with respect to the polling places. But in Minnesota, we have had some instances, thankfully isolated, but nonetheless disturbing, about elections administrators, not on election day, but on other days, being the subject of threats, harassment, and intimidation. And I'm not going to name names or counties, but I'll give you some examples, just so you don't think it's theoretical or overblown. One election administrator in one county told me that a member of her staff was followed to her car after hours in the parking lot by someone who was irate and yelling at her and had an elections-related grievance. Another told me that she herself different county, was the subject of repeated and unwanted telephone calls at her residence over the weekend by someone who had an elections related grievance of some kind. And then finally, there was another elections administrator in yet a third county who told me face to face that she was physically accosted in her office at the public counter and that they had to call the sheriff, thankfully located in the same building, to come and help her. And that was jarring to her, and charges were filed and the like. So what we did in 2023 was we had a suite of reforms with respect to election worker protection. I won't go into chapter and verse except to say that we beefed up and added more tools to law enforcement, and made some decisions by category about which things could possibly rise to a felony. And let's just say there are more enforcement tools in place now for law enforcement at the polling place. That's something that our partners in the counties and cities really wanted. That's something that we were able to produce for them. And we don't want anyone involved in elections, whether it's someone who's an election judge on election day or someone who does this the other 364 days a year, to not be in this field or think for a minute that they should not be involved in elections because they're worried about someone accosting them or threatening them or harassing them or intimidating them. We can't have that. As I said, blessedly in Minnesota, the examples have been few and far between. They've been pretty isolated, but we want to keep it that way. And we know from the experience of many others in other states that has not been the case. And we don't want that problem visiting us in Minnesota. So I think we're in a pretty good place. I want to talk briefly about something else that we were able to get done last year, and that has to do with efforts aimed at combating election disinformation. And just to talk about terms here, when I talk about disinformation in elections, I'm not talking about disagreement. That's as American as apple pie. If anyone on this meeting or anyone anywhere in Minnesota has a strong disagreement with me about elections policy or practice or procedures, that's fine. That's not disinformation. That's a difference of opinion. When I talk about disinformation, I'm talking about the intentional spread of knowingly false information about what the system is, not what it ought to be. What it ought to be is always the subject for debate and always should be. But what it is, how it actually works, and if someone's trying to mislead voters by misdescribing intentionally what it is, that is a real problem. And aided, I would say, and made more real and more of a possibility in this day and age by artificial intelligence, specifically something like deepfakes. Let me give you an example of that, sort of a contrast. So a while ago, I remember seeing a copy, I don't have it with me now, but a copy of a paper flyer, good old-fashioned Xerox paper flyer, that was placed in the doors of residences in certain neighborhoods in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, just before the 2000 presidential election. That was Bush versus Gore, remember. So Milwaukee, Wisconsin, certain neighborhoods, flyers in the door. And what the flyer said was, in essence, I'm paraphrasing, hey, everybody, remember, big election coming up in a few days. Just keep in mind, if your last name is A through L, you vote on Tuesday. If it's M through Z, you vote on Wednesday. Now, that is a classic case of disinformation. Someone trying to mislead people by giving them the wrong information about elections, just blatantly wrong, in an attempt to mislead and misdirect them for presumably political advantage. Now, fast forward to 2024. And by the way, I have no idea whether one person or three people or 100 people or no people were taken in by that ruse. But fast forward to 2024, now imagine the same message. But instead of a good old-fashioned, almost quaint paper flyer, now it's a deepfake. And it's a deepfake video of the mayor of Milwaukee saying the same thing, or a Milwaukee Bucks basketball player, or a faith leader, or a business leader, or someone else who's a trusted voice in the community. You see where I'm going with this. So it's particularly fraught because this disinformation can now have real consequences beyond just the paper flyer. So we passed a law basically saying that if a person knowingly peddles false information about sort of the mechanics of the election, and they do it with the intention of interfering with another's right to vote, which is a high bar, then they're subject to some penalties. I think that's sensible. I don't know a particular test case yet. I hope we'll never get one, but it's quite possible in the next 5.5 months or so that we will. And I think we'll now be primed and ready for that. A couple more that I wanted to mention. One is a reform that passed Minnesota last year, somewhat controversial, maybe even on this call, but one that I have long supported and I used to carry when I was in the Minnesota House, and that is the National Popular Vote Initiative. Um, here's what the National Popular Vote Initiative is. It's a pledge by states, Minnesota now included, to allocate their electoral votes in a particular way so as to ensure that the winner of the Electoral College will always be the winner of the popular vote. Let me zoom out and explain. Many of you are familiar, of course, with the Electoral College. You know it's a constitutional process and procedure. It's basically a point system. I don't know why it's called the Electoral College. It's a bunch of points. And the more population you have, the more points you have. But the Constitution is crystal clear on one point. These points that we all get based on population as states, we get to allocate them in any manner of our choosing. It is not mandated in the Constitution. The opposite is true. States are able to allocate their points in any manner that they choose. It just so happens that by custom and tradition, 48 states have chosen, and it is a choice. It's nowhere in the Constitution. 48 states, including Minnesota, have chosen to allocate them on a winner-take-all basis, meaning if you win Minnesota by one vote, you get all the points. We have 10 points. So you get all 10 if you win Minnesota. And that's been the case in Minnesota for a long, long time. There are two states you may know, Nebraska and Maine, that allocate theirs based on congressional districts. So you get 2 electoral votes if you win the entire state, and then the rest are allocated based on a congressional district. So just to give you an example, a ridiculous couple of examples, just to emphasize the point, under the Constitution, if Minnesota wanted to say, you know what, we're going to allocate our 10 points based on the tallest candidate. That's going to be our rule going forward. That's a dumb idea, but probably constitutional. Or if we said, you know, what we'd like to do is allocate our points in Minnesota, our 10 electoral votes, to the candidate with the most letters in their last name. Also a very dumb idea, but probably constitutional because we have total authority in terms of how we want to allocate those electoral votes. Okay, so back to national popular vote. All that it is a compact among the states saying that if enough states, adding up to 270 electoral votes, the amount needed to win, of course, if and only if all enough states adding up to 270 do what Minnesota has just done, then we will agree at that moment forward to allocate our points, our electoral votes, to the winner of the national popular vote. Whoever gets the most votes in America gets our 10 points, our 10 electoral votes. Now, we passed it last year. It won't kick in this year. It may not kick in for many years. It may not kick in for decades. Minnesota got the total electoral vote count up to 205, so 205 states worth of electoral votes passed it. Maine has since followed us, so now it's up to 209. But, you know, that's 50, I'm sorry, that's 209. That's 61 more electoral votes worth of states left to go that have to ratify it. And that could take a very, very long time. But I thought it was important to do because in my personal opinion, it is no longer tenable for this country, as big as it is, as influential as it is, as diverse as it is. And when I say diverse, I don't mean just the traditional lines of diversity. I mean diversity of everything in this country. It is no longer tenable for us to say that even though for every other office under the sun, the top vote getter gets the job, that for this one office, which happens to be the biggest office, we increasingly see the person who took second place get the job. This is not a slight on President Donald Trump or President George W. Bush, who both lost the popular vote but won the Electoral College. They won fair and square. They won according to the rules then in place, and their campaigns would have been much, much different had the rules been different. They won. They legitimately won their elections, and this is not meant to, avenge their victory or anything like that. But going forward, we just can't have it. We just cannot have that as a country. I don't care who wins. I don't care whether it's a Democrat or a Republican. That's my strong view. And Minnesota is now in that camp, in that club, but it won't kick in. It won't take an effect unless and until states adding up to 61 more electoral votes do likewise. Let me talk about money really quickly. It's not lost on our office and perhaps some of you that elections have gotten more and more expensive to administer. And that cost is usually borne by local governments, by counties and cities and townships. And one thing that I and we have been pushing for a long time is some state recognition of that fact. Um, and so one of the things that we got done last year that I and we are very proud of is we started a new fund, first time since statehood, which acknowledges for the first time that these things are expensive and aims to, even at the margins, defray some of the cost of administering elections. So we founded this or started this fund called the Voter Fund. There wasn't much money put in there at first, but the victory wasn't even starting it. This year, we managed to double the amount of money that was put into that fund. And it's not a buyout. No one in the counties or cities or townships have ever asked for that. They're not asking for the state to assume the costs of local election administration. But they are asking for the state to chip in and to help, at least at the margins, defray some of the costs, the recurring costs, and sometimes the uncertain costs of running an election. And so we've now done that. And we have that in place. And I think that's been a really great accommodation and signals to our local partners that we take their concerns seriously and that we value them as teammates and partners. So all of those reforms that I mentioned, there are others that I didn't, are things, as I said, that are nonpartisan in origin and nonpartisan in effect. There are things in some cases that were long overdue. There are things that I think are going to put Minnesota in an even better position in terms of that balance between accessibility and security that we are always chasing. And I think over the next 5.5 months, we're going to see that play out. And we're going to be glad that we passed those reforms when the dust settles on the 2024 election. There are challenges, though, that remain. There's no question about it. The biggest challenge, in my opinion, which the law can address, is what I talked about before, the myths and disinformation. It's not disagreement, it's disinformation. And at its worst, it can really be poisonous and really corrosive, and it can really mess with people and convince people who otherwise would vote not to vote, or convince people who do vote to vote the wrong way, and perhaps, even get themselves in trouble, depending on what the disinformation is. AI, as I mentioned, is an accelerant. I don't see AI as a new problem or threat or challenge, so much as I see it as a new way, a new means of amplifying or magnifying existing threats and challenges, meaning disinformation, which is a very old problem. It's not a new problem. So what can we do about that going forward? I'm intrigued by some of the legislative approaches. So last year, one other thing that I didn't mention, but really belongs in this discussion, is Minnesota became one of the first few states to impose an outright ban on deepfake election communications if two things are true, or three. A, if it happens within 90 days of an election. B, if the deepfake image is disseminated without the permission of the depicted person. And the third thing is that it is done with the intention of influencing the outcome of an election. And that last prong was meant to insulate things like satire, comedy, etc. Right? So, hey, if you can well imagine a car dealership or something having a fun ad with a deepfake image of Donald Trump and Joe Biden, in which those two people are saying something like, "Well, we don't agree on much, but we do agree that Rudy Luther Toyota is the best deal in town." This is meant to influence uh, protect that kind of speech. We haven't had any bites yet. We haven't had any occasion that I know of yet to enforce that law, but I think that's one start. Senator Klobuchar on the federal level has really been very inventive here as well. She's been holding hearings in her Senate Rules Committee, which she chairs for months on this topic. She actually had me out there last fall to testify in one particular aspect of this, and she has a suite of bills, of legislative proposals that I think will do a lot of good potentially. One is just a simple disclaimer saying that in federal elections, in particular, there's a disclaimer requirement. If you use generative AI, you got to say so somewhere in the ad. A second one is one that is more of an outright ban on materially, what's the word? I'm sorry, materially false AI-driven messages. Some people have raised First Amendment concerns. But I think it's worth exploring those kinds of concepts. And then the third one that she is championing lately has to do with requiring the Election Assistance Commission, which is a federal agency, to develop voluntary standards and guidelines for elections administrators in dealing with AI-related disinformation. I think that could go a long, long way towards helping a lot of folks, not just at the state level, but maybe particularly at the local level, react in real time to some of these challenges. But then there are some non-legal things that our office and all of us really can do. One is when it comes to disinformation generally, not just AI related disinformation, we have to lead with the truth. We have to say what's real. We have to say not just what's untrue, but what is true. And let me give you a quick example of that. I said at the very beginning, and I flagged it even, if you recall, that one of the things that we do not do in this office is we do not count votes. We don't do it. We're not in the same room. That's the responsibility reserved solely for counties, cities, and townships. They count the votes, not us. And yet right now, if you were to go and do a simple Google search, you will find on social media and elsewhere activists alleging that I, and not just I, but my colleagues in other states, are privately plotting and scheming in back rooms somewhere with our secret algorithms to spike the vote totals of candidates that we support and to depress the vote totals of those that we don't support. We don't do that. We don't count votes, right? I mean, it's not even something we do. It's not a matter of a disagreement or a difference of opinion. It's just, it's not on the menu. It's not part of what we do at all. So the more we can talk about what the system is, that's what one example, the better. And there are many ways we can do that across many areas of the election system, whether it's the integrity of the elections equipment, the actual tabulating equipment, whether it's the other end of the process, meaning post-election, all the post-election audits we have in state law and reviews and multiple layers of accountability and review, including judicial review. Those are things that we have to continually emphasize. So I'm going to be doing a lot of that over the next 5.5 months. We've done a lot of that the last couple of election cycles, I think, to good effect, but we've got to do that as well. Those aren't necessarily legal tools, but they're things I think we have to do. They're adjacent to the law in that we're reminding people of what the law is, what the rules are, what the system is. And hopefully that can deflect and help weaken the power of messages that say otherwise, that say that I or secretaries of state count votes, or say that the elections equipment is rigged, or that it is switching votes between candidate A or candidate B. Those are the kinds of things that I and we want to continue to do. So I think we're almost at time. I wanted to leave just a couple of minutes for any, not just questions, but answers. I mean, if you've got answers or advice or pushback or criticism or feedback of any kind, I'll take it.
While we're waiting for those to come in, any questions to come in, I'll just note again, I'll add the CLE credit number to the session. Um, and while we're waiting for questions as well, I just want to thank you again, Secretary Simon, for being here today and giving us this overview. Um, if you have questions, again, please enter them in the chat, and we'll wait for those.
And as we're waiting, I'll say this to anyone on this call or on this meeting. Let me give you my direct email at the office. There is no filterer, gatekeeper, screener, or anyone else. It comes right to me. So if today, tomorrow, next week, next month, next year, you have a comment or pushback or feedback on anything elections related, you can know where to reach me. And my email, same as many of you in terms of the state convention, it's just steve.simon@state.mn.us, steve.simon, S-I-M-O-N, at state.mn.us. Just shoot me an email. Want to give me a piece of your mind? Great. Criticism, pushback, anything you got.
And it looks like we did get one question in here. Would you support the ability for a voter to vote on election day from any polling place in Minnesota? Could require a change in state local laws.
Yes, it would require a change in state and local laws. And there are some states that have moved in that direction where it's not a polling place isn't fixed. It's sort of ballot on demand technology where you could somehow show, hey, yes, I work in St. Paul, but I live in Maple Grove. So I'm not voting on St. Paul contests. I'm voting on Maple Grove contests. Order me up my ballot here. It's doable. It's complicated. The short answer is yes, it's possible to do in some form. But it would take laws that change quite a bit of the architecture. But look, if there's public demand for that kind of thing, maybe that is the direction that we'll be headed.
I don't see any other questions that have come in here. We can give it another moment or two.
Well, I just want to say too, in that moment or two we're giving it, thanks again to all of you for having me. It's great to be with fellow lawyers. I too, I actually report this year, so we all need the credits. I'm no different. But I really appreciate this opportunity always, and thank you for all the work that you do. And it's an honor to have been invited to present to you. A lot went on last year in particular, less so I would say this year. We have a longstanding tradition, and it's only that. It's a tradition. It's not written anywhere, but we have a tradition, a sensible one, I think, in Minnesota at the legislature, which is to say, don't make a ton of new law changes to election law in the election year. So 23 was a really hot year, a lot of output, a lot of these reforms. Less so. It was more tame this year, more sort of revisiting and refining things that were passed last year, or passing things where the effective date is put out till 2026, because you just don't want to mess with the rules if you can possibly avoid it in the election year itself. And we've been true to that this year as well. So some good reforms passed this year, which I didn't discuss, things like conforming language for the Electoral Count Reform Act, things like Minnesota Voting Rights Act, which we could do a whole CLE on, uh, which I think is good, which backfills uh, provides some necessary backfill for some privileges that were basically taken away from the Eighth Circuit. But really, overall, I would say 2023 was the big year. This year was more measured.
And we don't have any other question. Oh, we just got another question. I will say though, before the questions, I do have a couple of private comments related to the Electoral College. We have a couple of participants who have uh, written that they believe is a mistake for states like Minnesota to eliminate the Electoral College. So just wanted to share those comments that are coming
No,
through.
that's fair, but I just want to say, to be fair, it's not eliminating the electoral college, it's using the electoral college. The electoral college is simply a point system, saying states, you get points, allocate them however you want. This isn't eliminating it, this is using it. We get to use our points any way we want. I even gave a couple of ridiculous examples. So this is not an elimination of it. It's using it the way that the framers intended. You might disagree about how it's used, but I wouldn't call it eliminating electoral college.
Right. And then a question here. We
We're
are at time. If you have a moment, the last question that's come in here is, what do you see as the biggest threat to election integrity in 2024?
Yeah, well, that term is in the eye of the beholder, election integrity. Different people mean different things. As I said at the outset, I want high turnout and low drama. I think what could affect the integrity is the drama part. What could affect the integrity are people saying things about the system as it is that are not true. I gave an example in passing, but this idea that elections equipment is changing votes from candidate A to candidate B, it's not true. It's provably not true in Minnesota and everywhere else I know of. And that kind of thing could introduce not just skepticism and doubt, but hostility where it doesn't belong, and where the hostility would have real bad downstream effects on people and their proclivity for voting. So I would say disinformation overall has the possibility to really adversely affect integrity. But you know, our office, and not just our office, we can't do it alone. A lot of partners and folks all over the state, we can rebut and pre-but, and we're doing that just so people understand what the system is. They don't even have to agree with or like what the system is, but I want folks to know as much as they can what that system is and how it really operates.
Thank you. And we did get another question in here. I want to be respectful of your time, so if you need to
Sure.
go, but I think this is an interesting question. What is the process for those in the Safe at Home program to vote when their
Mm,
address is
yes.
confidential and they have to vote at the polling location in which they live?
Well, they don't vote at the polling location at which they live, and that's one of the principles here. And by the way, and so one of the responsibilities we have in running that program is we almost do an absentee voting system within an absentee voting system just for safe and home participants. It's more complicated than the typical absentee voting system. It's all set forth in statute and administrative rule, so we're not making anything up as we go along. Um, And that's one of the reasons, maybe a principal reason why that program, the Safe at Home program, is even in our shop. A lot of people ask the question, why is that in the Secretary of State's office? That sounds sort of like a law enforcement thing. Why isn't Safe at Home something run by the Department of Public Safety or a county sheriff or something? What it seems like a mismatch. And the reason has to do with voting. The first ever Safe at Home program was started in Washington State in the early 90s. And it was started because they found that, unfortunately, resourceful abusers, let's say, were finding people who didn't want to be found. And they were doing that by using the voting rolls, which are public. So that was sort of the hook originally for why they ended up in Secretary of State offices. And the plurality of states that have this program, and we're in that group, have them through the Secretary of State. But there are states where it's run by their Attorney General's office or it's run by some law enforcement agency. So that's the hook. But yes, they do not go to their polling place.
Thank you. I think that's really good to know. I don't see any other questions here, so I think we can go ahead and wrap this up. Again, Secretary Simon, thank you so much for your time today.
My pleasure.
Really
Thanks,
appreciate
everybody.
it. And thank you everyone for attending.
Thanks, everyone.